Chapter 8 takes us through the next step of the flow of food, which is the preparation stage. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the correct ways for preparing food to make sure we're preventing cross-contamination and time temperature abuse. We're going to look at safe methods on how to thaw foods. We're going to talk about minimum internal cooking temperatures for TCS foods. We're also going to talk about the correct way to cook TCS food in a microwave oven, if you have to. We're going to look at the importance of informing consumers of risks when serving raw or undercooked food, the requirements for partially cooking TCS foods, methods and time temperature requirements for cooling of those TCS foods, and time temperature requirements for reheating of those same foods. So in general, and again, you've heard this more than a few times, but we want to make sure we are working clean. So making sure our workstations, our cutting boards, utensils are all cleaned and sanitized. We all want to make sure when we're working with TCS foods, especially, that we only remove as much food from the cooler as we need as far as for prepping. So we are preventing time temperature abuse. We don't need to have, you see the thing in the picture as far as looks like they're making ham sandwiches. You don't need to pull out 50 pounds of ham for the ham sandwiches because you're leaving that out for probably a lot longer than it actually needs to be. It's better to do it in a little bit smaller batches. And so that ham is not staying in the temperature danger zone for as long. So you're preventing that time temperature abuse from happening. Of course, we want to make sure we're returning prep foods to the cooler or cook it as quickly as possible. Again, the rule of thumb is to keep it out of the temperature danger zone or have it in the temperature danger zone for the minimum amount of time possible. Okay. Yes, we have the lag phase and stuff that we had talked about in chapter 2, but that doesn't mean it gives you the opportunity to actually intentionally leave TCS foods out at room temperature for an extended period of time. The general rule of thumb is if you're not using it, if it's TCS food, it needs to go back into the cooler or it needs to be cooked and held at the proper temperature. Food and color additives. So this is an interesting one when it comes to the setup for this, and it's kind of strange. So first and foremost, you only want to use additives approved by your health department and stuff. We want to make sure we're not using more additives than are allowed by law. Now, for most of us, that's going to be pretty minimal. Now, what we can find is, I'll give you an example for brining. When you're brining something, let's say I want to brine a turkey and then smoke it. By law, I'm only allowed to inject up to 10% of the weight of the animal or of the piece of meat with brine. So, and the reason that is because, especially when you buy something by weight, water is weight. And so if you're injecting brine in, they're paying for that extra water. So, that's of course, one side to it as far as the law of it, but also when you're getting into any preservatives and things along those lines, you have to be very careful. You want to make sure you're not adding too much and it end up hurting people because you've added too much. Okay. You never want to use additives to alter the appearance of food. Again, this is kind of you make sure that people can still see that it's food. If you're doing things that changing it up, make sure that your service staff, chef, cooks know what's going on. For example, in modern cuisine, Chef Keith uses transglutaminase, which is a fancy word. We call it meat glue. It's a protein binder. And so you can take proteins, and by adding this, it actually acts as glue, binds there. So you can take, for example, you can take shrimp, puree it up in a food processor, seasonings and all that fun stuff, add the transglutaminase, mix it together, let it work its magic, and then you can push it through I'm gonna use the term. It's kind of, it reminds me of like the Play-Doh. When you extrude out the Play-Doh, you push it out and the shapes come out. You can do an extruding of this product, and you can actually make shrimp noodles. They're literally made with that shrimp. So the transglutaminase binds it and turns it into noodles. So that's altering the appearance of food to an extent, but again, it's one of those that you need to make sure that people are aware of what's going on. Also, just so you don't accidentally introduce an allergen or something along those lines to them, especially like a shrimp noodle. Somebody thinks they're noodles, they don't know they're actually made of shrimp, and they have a seafood allergy. Whoop, we got an issue there. Right? Do not sell any produce that was treated with sulfites before it was received in the operation. Sulfites are used for very specific items and for extending of shelf life on some things. The thing is with most produce, it's not going to get, especially if it's not going to get cooked or anything, you don't necessarily get rid of those sulfites. And we want to make sure we're not introducing that to our guests. And to go along with that, you don't want to add sulfites to produce that will be eaten raw. But again, especially with the produce, you don't, unless you know that you're going to be cooking it. And yes, it does help with some shelf life extension. However, we don't necessarily want to play Russian roulette. Is it going to be cooked? Is it not going to be cooked? Which ones are treated? Which ones are not? That type of thing, especially when it comes to our guests' well-being. So presenting food honestly. Again, you would think this would be common sense, but common sense is not always so common. Making sure that you're not doing things to misrepresent the food. So it's always good to make sure that you're not adding, unless there's, need be any food additives or color additives, any colored overwrap. I know sometimes, like around the holidays, we like to do cookie exchanges, and maybe you'll get the really cool festive green saran wrap to put over the cookies, which, looks nice when you're getting them to your aunt and uncle or whatever that case may be. But you never do something like that in the commercial setting, because and I know it seems like a far-fetched thing, but technically it misrepresents the product itself. Same thing with lights. If you're using colored lights to highlight, it could also misrepresent the appearance of food itself. The one that I'm personally concerned about is this next part here. Make sure you're presenting it the way it was described. What you tell your customer you're going to give them, make sure you give them. So again, if a menu says fried perch, make sure you're giving them fried perch. I mean, even as simple as if your menu says 2 grilled pork chops, make sure they get 2 grilled pork chops. Probably one that gets abused a lot is when you get into some of the fancier stuff. So for example, let's say they're doing a salad, and on the salad, it says Roquefort cheese. So Roquefort cheese, if you're not aware, is a type of blue cheese, but it's made in France, in the Roquefort region of France, by very, very specific standards. You'll learn more about that in Garde Manger class down the road. But Roquefort is blue cheese, but blue cheese, not all blue cheeses are Roquefort. So if on your menu you say Roquefort cheese for the salad, make sure you're giving them Roquefort cheese and not a Gorgonzola, or even worse, just a generic blue cheese, especially if there's being an upcharge for it. You just want to make sure that you got that truth in advertising when it comes to what you are presenting to the guests on the menu and what they're actually receiving when it comes to the plate. Okay? And again, if it's not presented honestly, it does need to be thrown out. So again, just make sure you're being conscientious of how you are presenting and labeling your food. So some corrective actions. So in the following situations, we need to throw food out if it was handled by staff who had been restricted or excluded because of illness, if it became contaminated by hands or bodily fluid from the nose or mouth, or when it's exceeded the time temperature requirements designed to keep food safe. Those are some general corrective actions that we would take if those scenarios would happen. We would need to make sure that we threw that food out and not serve it or try to cool it, reheat it, all that fun stuff. So looking at thawing our food. So the ideal way to thaw your food is in the refrigerator at 41 degrees or lower. Okay. In your cooler, let it thaw. Now, note if you're cooling something or you're thawing something in the refrigerator, your cooler, depending on the size of it, it might take a little while. You know, that turkey picture you see there, that's not going to thaw in 12 hours. Heck, I don't even know if that's going to thaw in 24 hours. You're looking at maybe 2 to 3 days in your refrigerator for that frozen turkey to completely thaw. So what that means is you have to be thinking far enough ahead to make sure you pull that turkey early enough so it has time to thaw in the refrigerator and it's ready to go for whatever you're going to do with it. Another option is submerging your food under running drinkable water at 70 degrees or lower. Right. Of course, we're doing that. We want to make sure our food prep sink and what we're putting the stuff in is clean and sanitized. We want to make sure that you have enough water going, that's the flow is strong enough to wash away any food bits. And what we need to make sure is that the temperature of the food itself does not go above 41 degrees. And if it does, it's not above 41 degrees for longer than 4 hours. If it's above 41 degrees for longer than 4 hours, you have to pitch it. So again, you need to be conscientious about that. So, you know, technically you can put that turkey and run it underwater. It's not going to be real fast like the picture of the chicken breasts and stuff, but it's going to be faster than keeping it in your cooler for 2 or 3 days. But then you also have water usage that comes along with it. You should never be using hot water to thaw your product because you're going to dump that temperature up way too fast. Plus, depending on how hot you have it, it could actually start to cook the food a little bit on the outside. I've actually seen that happen. So you really want to avoid that. Make sure that the water that you're using is at 70 degrees or even lower than that. If you're going to thaw food in a microwave, you want to make sure that once you thaw it in the microwave, that it immediately goes to conventional cooking equipment after thawing. So you don't thaw it in the microwave and then throw it back in the refrigerator and let it set for a day. If you're going to thaw it in the microwave, it goes from the microwave to wherever you're going to cook it, the grill, the saute pan, the oven, whatever the case may be. So if you're doing thawing as part of a microwave, make sure you immediately cook it afterwards. Now you can thaw food as part of the cooking process. So for example, you can take out a frozen hamburger patty like you see there in the picture, and you can throw that frozen patty directly on the grill and it's cooking and it's thawing at the same time. So, you know, you've got that option as well when it comes to as far as thawing is concerned. So you also can do some foods that are called slacked before you're cooking. So if you're slacking a frozen food, that's the gradual thawing of the frozen food to prep it. So it helps to allow for some even frying, especially. So for example, you might take some frozen breaded chicken breasts and warm them up from that frozen state at 0 or whatever to, you know, the 41 or below. So sometimes you'll see that where you'll take frozen food, you'll put it in the refrigerator and you'll let it soften up or you'll let it slack. So when you deep fry it, then it cooks a lot more evenly than if you have it frozen on the outside, or sorry, frozen on the inside, and that outside's getting cooked real fast. So that's another option as well, especially if you're using some ready to eat fried products. You'll see sometimes that kitchens will slack some of those frozen products, especially if they know that they're a big seller, because it also cuts down on the temperature loss that happens in the deep fat fryer, because you're now dropping in, like, let's say 25-degree chicken instead of -5-degree chicken. If that makes sense to you. So if you have reduced oxygen packaging products, especially fish, we want to make sure we are thawing it carefully, because it is in an anaerobic environment because they've reduced the oxygen out of it. Just make sure you're first off reading the label. If the label states that a product has to be frozen until use, then remove from the packaging before you thaw under refrigeration or immediately after thawing under running water. So once it's thawed, it should not be in the packaging. Okay. So if you have reduced oxygen packaging with fish and it says it remain frozen until ready to use, you thaw it under under running water. As soon as it's thawed, take it out of the package. If you're going to thaw it under refrigeration, take it out of the package first, then thaw it under refrigeration. But you do not want to thaw it in the packaging because it could create an environment, especially if time temperature abuse happens, it could create environment for bacteria, for any type of microbe growth. So if you're packaging fish using the ROP method, first, it's typically frozen before, during, or after packaging. I've seen it all three ways. You need to make sure that there's a label that states that the fish must be frozen until used. That's just kind of a standard that comes along with any of the fish. Again, it goes back to that preface that we want to make sure that we're not accidentally creating a good environment for bacteria growth or any other microbe growth during our thawing out process. Of course, any type of meat, seafood, poultry, we want to make sure, of course, clean and sanitize areas, cutting boards, knives, utensils. Ideally, we want to prep those products separately or at different times from fresh produce. So if you have a separate area that you can prep your meats and stuff, do that than you do with your veggies and stuff. If not, don't prep them at the exact same time. Cut your veggies and everything first, get everything cleaned up, and then take care of that raw meat. If for whatever reason you absolutely have to do the raw meat first, take care of it and be very meticulous in cleaning and sanitizing to make sure we are not cross-contaminating our produce and stuff when that gets started to work on after. Like I mentioned earlier, make sure with meat, seafood, and poultry, you're only removing as much food from the cooler as can be prepped at one time without time temperature abuse, and making sure we're returning that raw product to the cooler as quickly as we can after we prep it. Again, we don't want the time temperature abuse to be an issue. So if you are prepping salads that contain TCS foods, so pasta salad, chicken salad, egg salad, potato salad, that type of thing. Again, small batches are better. Typically, we like to use leftovers, which is kind of cool about those salads, that you can take, let's say, leftover baked potatoes and then turn them into potato salad, or you can use leftover pasta that didn't get eaten and turn into pasta salad. So it's a great way of utilizing product and minimizing waste. However, the only way you should be able to, you can use those leftover products is if you've handled them correctly and safely beforehand. So we want to make sure that they've been cooked and held at the proper temperatures. And of course, we want to make sure that they have been cooled correctly. And just like all TCS foods, you have to remember that, once it's been made, that clock ticks and you have 7 days as far as storage at 41 or lower. So once you've made that potato salad, after 7 days, it has to be pitched if it's not used. Again, make sure you're conscientious of that and your usage of that product as well, because you want to make sure you don't have so much left over that you end up having to throw product away because you made too much of it. Something the book mentions, of course, is to actually consider chilling on not only the ingredients, but also the utensils, the bowl, the whisk, whatever you might be using before use, again, just to help keep it as long as possible out of the temperature danger zone. And of course, you want to make sure you're leaving your food in the cooler until your ingredients will be mixed. Don't let them set out. Obviously, your TCS foods, especially, you don't want to have those in. So what if you are working with raw eggs? So if you notice, there's pooled eggs. So pooled eggs are what you see there. They're eggs that are cracked open and then combined into a container. So that's the term that we use for from sanitation standpoint is pooled eggs. If you're using them, of course, we got to be conscientious about it. We want to cook them promptly after mixing, or make sure we store them at 41 or below. And we want to make sure we're cleaning and sanitizing containers between batches, again, just to help minimize the risk of salmonella, any cross contamination going on. Another option is to consider using pasteurized shell eggs or pasteurized egg products that use little to no cooking. So like, for example, mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is a cold sauce where egg yolk binds the oil in the liquid together. So it acts as what they call an emulsifier. You'll learn about that in another class. But you have to use raw eggs. You can't use cooked eggs in order for the emulsification to happen. And we're usually not cooking mayonnaise. I mean, sometimes we do it as part of a bake or something like that, but for the most part, you're not. And so if you are making mayonnaise from scratch, the good rule of thumb is to buy pasteurized eggs or pasteurized egg yolks so that you are minimizing the risk as far as there being any microbes that could cause foodborne illness in those eggs, okay? Especially since chances are there won't be a lot of cooking going on. Of course, we want to make sure we're cleaning and sanitizing equipment used to prep the eggs, just like we would for our meats, poultry, and seafood, because we don't want to run the risk of cross-contamination happening. If you are serving high risk population, we talked about that in a different chapter. So young kids, the elderly, those with compromised immune systems, you really need to do pasteurized eggs or eggs products. Doing raw unpasteurized eggs is not necessarily a good idea because they're already susceptible to getting sick because of their age or because of their immune system. And so it doesn't make sense to play Russian roulette with them as far as, hey, is this going to make you sick, especially since they're at a higher risk of already getting sick. Okay. Now, unpasteurized shell eggs can be used, but you have to make sure that you're cooking the product all the way through. So you're making a cake with it, or you're cooking omelets. If somebody wants their eggs over easy, you'd want to use a pasteurized egg for that if they're in those high risk populations. And of course, like I said earlier, making sure you're cleaning and sanitizing everything in between. Starting to get a little trend here going on, don't you think? So battered and breaded foods. Like you've seen before, small batches are best, especially because a lot of times when you're battering or breading, you're probably working with TCS foods. So you don't want them sitting out temperature danger zone for too long. Store unused batter as quickly as possible. Again, keeping that out of the temperature danger zone because it has TCS foods typically in the batter, which makes the batter TCS as well. Throwing out any unused batter or breading after a set amount of time. Again, depending on how long things are going, you want to make sure you're not using that batter and subjecting it to time temperature abuse. It's always better to pitch that and get a new batch, especially when it's been out in temperature danger zone for too long. Err on that side of caution. Of course, you want to then cook your food thoroughly. And if you're deep frying, make sure the oil temperature recovers before loading each batch. So what that means is, let's say you have it set to 350 degrees. You drop something into fry, that drops that cooking temperature. I need to wait until it gets back up to 350 degrees before I drop anything else in, because if I keep lowering and lowering the temperature, it doesn't fry. What happens is the fat actually absorbs into the product. And then when it finally gets hot enough and creates that crisp crust, or however you battered or breaded it, now that fat that's got absorbed into your product is now stuck in there. And then you're going to get greasy food. 9 times out of 10, if you have a fried product and it feels greasy to you, it's usually because they've overloaded the fryer and the temperature dropped too much and it wasn't able to create that crisp outside to it. It allowed it to come in and get absorbed in because the temperature was not hot enough. So for that, it's for recovery, making sure you're not overloading your baskets, and of course monitoring the oil and food temperatures and cooking times. Making sure your fryer oil is at the proper temperature for what you need it to do, using your thermometers to making sure your food internal temperatures of your food is at the proper times, and seeing where you're at time wise, so you can get an idea of, okay, a batch of this product is going to take this long. So if you are doing fresh juice that you're going to package for sale later, so let's say you have an orange tree, or access to fresh oranges, and you're going to juice them, you're going to put them in pint containers, and then you're going to turn around and sell them later for retail. Right. First off, the juice should be labeled, or treated with, which means pasteurized, and you have to have a approved HACCP plan, which we'll talk about in a second. That's what HACCP is, HACCP. We'll talk about that soon. So that's the first thing. Ideally, it needs to be pasteurized to make sure it's safe, that we minimize the risk of somebody getting sick by drinking that juice. Or as an alternative, you have a warning such as what you see here. This product has not been pasteurized and therefore may contain harmful bacteria that can cause serious illness in children, the elderly, and people with weakened immune systems. So it's that disclaimer that's going in to make sure that, hey, you're more than welcome to purchase this, but there is a bit of a risk because of the fact that it has not been pasteurized. I'm guessing most of us, fresh juice for packaged later sale will probably not be an issue. But again, it's one of those things we cover because, a lot of different people take this course throughout the world, throughout the United States, at least, right? And some of them might be doing it because they're going to start their own juice bar or something along those lines. So something that, it's covered because it could potentially happen. For produce, we want to make sure, of course, our produce is not touching surfaces that's been exposed to any raw product that hasn't been properly cleaned and sanitized. Making sure we're washing produce thoroughly before doing any prep work to it. To wash produce, we want to run water that's a little bit warmer than the produce, and make sure you're rinsing off the outside. And then anything that is like a leafy green, if we pull apart and we rinse it thoroughly, because dirt and stuff like that can get in between those layers. We just want to make sure we're getting rid of any visible soil and contamination that might be there. The other thing, you do have certain chemicals, when used in the right ratios, can be used to wash produce that will help with making sure it's safe, and also sometimes helping with extending the shelf life. So if you are soaking or storing produce in standing water or in a mixed ice water slurry, ice water combination, you don't want to mix different items in that soaking product, and you don't want to do multiple batches of the same item. Make sure that each batch has its own storage container with the water or with the ice water mix. Okay. We need to refrigerate and hold cut melons, cut tomatoes, and cut leafy greens at 41 degrees or lower. Those are all considered TCS foods. Now, yes, I know at the beginning, when it comes to tomatoes, you set them out to ripen. Melons are usually set in the grocery store, not refrigerated. Now, if you notice, it says cut. So what it is there's a potential for bacteria and microbes to be on the outside. And even if you wash it, doesn't mean it's going to get rid of it. And then as soon as you cut with the knife goes through the outside, so the rind of that melon, and then potentially spreads the bacteria that was on the outside into the melon itself. Well, if you don't refrigerate it, then after that, then you run the risk of that bacteria that was on the outside of the rind gone onto the actual fruit or what have you. Now it's created that environment for it to grow. So we want to make sure that once you've cut melons, once you've diced or sliced or whatever tomatoes, and once you've cut your greens for your salads and stuff, that they are TCS foods now, and they need to be held at 41 or lower. If you are working with a high-risk population, you do not want to serve raw seed sprouts. And the reason why is because of the nature of raw seed sprouts, like alfalfa sprouts, broccoli sprouts, things like that. You can't wash them, because if you wash them, you will destroy them. And so you have to serve them as they are, which again, if you have a high risk population, you're potentially playing Russian roulette with those people, because you can't say, hey, we did everything we could to help minimize the risk of foodborne illness. We can't wash it because of the nature of the product itself. Ice. We don't usually think about this, but remember, everyone, ice is food. And you know it is because at least one point in your life, you've taken and you've chewed on ice. And if you get that little nugget ice, like from Sonic or something like that, that's like a treat sometimes, right? We chew on that all the time. So even though we don't think of it necessarily that way, remember, ice is a food and we need to treat it like other food items. First and foremost, of course, we want to make sure that the ice is being made with potable water, water that's safe for us to drink. Never use ice as an ingredient if it was used to keep food cold. So if you're putting ice, let's say in a bus tub, and then setting a bowl of potato salad in that to help keep the potato salad cold, that ice is no longer food. All right. That ice is refrigeration. So do not then take the bowl out and then use that ice to chill down a Pepsi or whatever the case may be, unless it's a bottle. Okay, but you're not going to put it in a glass and then add fountain soda to it or anything like that, because now it is not food, it's a refrigeration technique. Okay. Making sure our containers and our scoops are always sanitized is good. Making sure you're storing your scoops outside of the ice machine in a clean, protected location. You never want to store the scoop in the ice machine itself. Here at ICC for culinary, ours is bolted to the wall right next to our ice machine in a visible, very convenient location, but we don't store it actually in the machine. Never hold ice in containers that held chemicals or raw meat, seafood, or poultry. One of the best things you can do, they actually make ice totes. That's all they're made. That's what they're made for. You know, they are made for you to start at the ice machine, fill it up, and then take it to the bar to fill the ice bin, or take it to the server station, fill the ice bin, or take it to the kitchen to fill a place that you're holding your stuff over ice or what have you. I mean, they make equipment specifically for that. And so, of course, you don't want to take the old 5-gallon bucket of soap that you use for your dishwasher and then start running ice with it. That hopefully common sense kicks in. You go, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do. But again, I got to talk to you about it because, you know, like I said earlier, common sense is not necessarily so common. Okay. The other thing, and I know we're all guilty of it, you know, it just seems more convenient or to have you, but you never want to touch ice with your hands or use a glass to scoop ice. For one thing, we don't want to touch ice with our hands because it's a ready to eat product. So you never bare hand a ready to eat product. You would never use a glass to scoop ice, because if that glass happens to break, chip, or anything along those lines, you have to destroy all of that ice, because you can't tell the difference necessarily at that time between what's ice and what's glass. And the last thing you want to do is fill up a glass with ice that has glass shards in it and then turn around and serve it to your customer. So that's why you never, ever, did I mention ever, use a glass to go into the ice bin to fill up the ice. That's what the scoops are for. Those are specifically made for that job. So never use a glass to scoop ice. And of course, never bare hand the ice, due to the fact that it is a ready to eat food. So there are some things that if you are doing this, you need to have a variance from your health department. Right? So pretty much you have to get permission from your health department to allow you to do specific things or different things. So for example, if you're packaging that fresh juice on site for sale later, unless the juice has a warning label, you need to have a variance for it. Right? Because you're going to have to make sure that's been pasteurized, and pasteurization is a specialty thing that is, you can do it more in the kitchen than we used to, but it is something that is still fairly new. And so if you're doing that and not putting the warning label on it, you need to have a variance. If you are smoking food to preserve it, but not to enhance the flavor, you need a variance. So if you are smoking barbecue and you're going to be serving it that day, if you're going to serve it that day, not a problem. All right. If you are smoking a salmon and serving it within that 24 hours or so, you're fine. If you're trying to smoke something and because you want to hold it now for 2 months, because you're trying to preserve it by smoking, then you need a variance from the health department, because you get into very specific things as far as water activity, as far as pH and things along those lines, that you need to make sure you have special setups for that. And you need that variance from the health department in order to make sure you're doing it safe and not going to hurt anybody. If you are using food additives or components to preserve or alter the food so that no longer needs time and temperature control for safety, if you want to take some that's TCS and add some components to not make it TCS anymore, then you need to have a variance. All right. And so, and I'll give you examples. So let's say you want to make pickles. Pickles are awesome. Love making homemade pickles, especially because you can control the garlickiness or the sweet or the sour or the heat or whatever the case may be. If you're going to make them and refrigerate them and then use them, on a regular basis, that's cool. If you want to make pickles and you want to put them in the mason jars and be able to hold them at room temperature, kind of like you get the Vlasic dills or whatever that you get at the grocery store, and you want to do that in your restaurant, you need a variance. Okay, because you are trying to get rid of the TCS component of that product. You're not doing it just as a flavor enhancer or to add value to a product. You're doing it to help with extending the shelf life. So you need a variance for that. Okay? And of course, along the same lines, if you are doing something that you're curing foods, you need a variance. So we actually have a curing cabinet here at the college that we use for advanced charcuterie and butchery. And we do some fun things with it. We can dry age beef. We can make our own salumi, things along those lines. But if you see it, when you go in the kitchen sometime, you'll see the right door has our stuff hanging in it. It says for educational purposes only. The reason being is that I cannot turn around and sell the food that's coming out of there, because we are not set up for that, because we don't have a variance for curing food. And the thing is to have the variance for curing food, we would have to have it sent out and get samples. And again, water activity, pH, all that stuff that's coming along for it. And so we need to make sure that for us, we're doing it for the educational side of it, not because we're going to turn around and sell it to customers. But if you want to do that, then you need to make sure you have a variance from the health department, because you are getting into that potential time temperature abuse if you don't do it right. If you decide you want to do some custom processing for personal use, so for example, let's say you're going to offer to dress deer and break down deer at your restaurant for the consumer, you need to have a variance for it, because the food that's coming into your kitchen all has to be inspected. We talked about that, I think last chapter. And the stuff that your friend or your family member or whatever, that they went and got the deer themselves, it's not being inspected by the USDA or state agency. It's coming from the woods to your kitchen, and you're going to be processing it. The thing is you have to have that variance, because the fact that you have to use product that has been inspected. And so if you're bringing non-inspected product in, there needs to be a variance. There needs to be protocol set up, because none of that product can be used for sale at your location. All that product has to be used for personal use. So it is going back to whoever brought that deer, in this case, in, for them to consume on their own. You can't sell it. You can't use it in a recipe at your restaurant or anything like that. Okay. If you are doing anything that is reduced oxygen, the ROP, like you see there in the picture, you do need also to have a variance. And again, the reason why it's reduced oxygen packaging is really cool and can do a lot of cool things. But because it's reduced oxygen, remember, we increase the risk of potential anaerobic microbes from wreaking havoc. And so we need to make sure we have our HACCP plan set up so we are proactive as far as these steps where the bad stuff could happen and how we minimize that impact. Okay. If you are sprouting seeds or beans that you're going to use in your kitchen for your restaurant, you need to have a variance for that as well. Because again, it's something that there you see a lot of chefs that are doing, like, they have their own herb gardens and things along those lines, and that's perfectly fine. But if you want to do your own in-house, I don't know, alfalfa sprouts, you need a variance for that because of the higher risk that comes along with it. The last one here, and you used to see it maybe again, if you've ever been to Red Lobster, one of the things when you walk into the waiting area lobby, they've got the big tank and they've got the live lobsters in it. Well, if you're offering live shellfish from a display tank, you must have a variance. So you go to Red Lobster there in Peoria and you see their lobster tank, they had to apply to the health department for a variance for that tank. Again, because it's taking things into consideration that are outside the general scope of sanitation through our kitchens and stuff. And so the health department wants to make sure that you are being proactive and doing things to make sure that you are minimizing the chance of people getting sick. So practices that have special requirements. Like I said, a HACCP plan is probably going to be required when applying for a variance. The HACCP plan looks at food safety risk. Where are the risks of this plan? Where are the risks of doing this product? It's going to require you then to put together a plan and making sure you're complying with the plan and procedures that are coming into play. And then you also have to have documentation that has to be maintained and then provided upon request of the sanitarian. So there's a lot of paperwork in instances when it comes to HACCP plans. But again, with HACCP, and we'll talk a little bit more about it soon, it's one of those that we want you to be proactive instead of reactive. Think about where the potential issues are and how we can then avoid or minimize those risks. So some things that the records that we'll have to show, procedures for how you monitor those critical control points. Are you regularly monitoring those points? Are you taking the necessary corrective actions if it fails a point? And are you verifying how effective the procedures or the process are at? Are some records that come out there. Okay. So, okay, a big part, of course, with prep is how we cook our food. Okay, what is the requirements? So, and I'll tell you, I know that the PowerPoint and what I'm going to tell you is different from what the book says. Reason being is the copyright on this book, I believe, is 2017, 2017. And it was changed, I believe, in 2020 for some changes. And this is the big one. So if you are cooking poultry, whether it's whole or ground chicken, turkey or duck, if you're cooking stuffing that's made with fish, meat, or poultry, if you've stuffed meat, seafood, poultry, or pasta, or dishes that include previously cooked TCS ingredients. So again, you're going to reheat your potatoes after you've baked potatoes, you've chilled them, you've diced them up, you're going to put them in for soup to make potato soup. All of those, because of that, you have to cook to 165 degrees. It's instantaneous. So as soon as it hits 165 degrees, that's the minimum internal temperature it needs to be. And the minimum internal temperature is from the thickest part of the product. So where that differs, if you look at your book, is the book says it's 165 degrees for 15 seconds. Okay, that was the old standard. And so you can see just in the matter of a couple years, the standards do change. And that's why you have to go and recertify as far as sanitation. And that's why your sanitation certificates and things like that are not good, forever. You have to go and recertify because the rules sometimes change, the guidelines change, and you need to make sure you are up with what are the newest guidelines when it comes to sanitation. So if you're cooking poultry, you're cooking chicken, turkey, or what have you, it's 165 degrees. Once it hits it in the thickest part of that piece of meat, you're good to go. If you've made a stuffing that has chicken or meat or fish in it, 165. If you've stuffed something into meat, seafood, poultry, or you've got like ravioli, stuffed pasta, 165. Again, like if you're doing that potato soup using previously cooked baked potatoes, 165. That's your temperature. Okay, very important to know, okay? Especially that chicken one. Poultry is especially important. At 165 is that hard and fast when it comes to traditional cooking. Now, if you're doing some alternative cooking, like through sous vide, low temperature cooking, there are alternative minimum temperatures for that. If that's something that interests you, take Modern Cuisine with Chef Keith sometime down the road, and you'll learn more about those and the benefits and things that go along with those as well. If you are working with ground product, so burgers, sausage, ground fish, for whatever reason, whatever that case may be, it needs to be at 155 for 17 seconds. Again, look at the book. It used to be 15 seconds. More research has been done to find that it needs to actually be a couple seconds longer to make sure that it is considered safe to eat. So it needs to be 17 seconds. If you are mechanically tenderizing meat with needles or blades, or you're injecting it with brine or flavors, so a brined ham, flavor injected roast, you're doing a country fried steak that you've jacquarded the meat before you breaded it and deep fried it, 155 is there. If you are vacuum tumbling meat with marinades or other solutions, also 155. And then any ground meat from game animals that have been commercially raised and inspected, all of that is 155. So 165 instantaneously for poultry, 155 for 17 seconds for ground meat. Okay. The other ones too, ratites, ostrich and emu need to be there, should be there. Ground seafood, including chopped or minced, and any shell eggs that will be held for service need to be there too. Now 145, 15 seconds, that hasn't changed, is seafood, fish, shellfish, crustaceans, steaks, chops, pork, veal, and lamb should all be cooked to 145 for 15 seconds to be considered safe. Shell eggs that will be served immediately. So technically you want to make sure they're up to 145 if you're cooking eggs for breakfast. And commercially raised game are all items that need to be at 145 for 15 seconds in order to be considered safe. Now, if you are doing roasts of something larger, you do have alternative cooking times. So at 145 degrees internally, it needs to be held there for 4 minutes at 145 internally in order to be safe. Okay. If you want to roast a lower temperature, so let's say you want it 130 degrees, it needs to be internal temperature of 130 degrees for 112 minutes in order to be considered safe to eat. And you can see working its way how it goes: 89 minutes, 56, 36, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all alternative cooking time temperatures. So you're thinking about something like prime rib, right? You don't want to necessarily cook prime rib to medium, because if you do, you're gonna, upset people that like theirs rare or medium rare. Well, if you're gonna do prime rib and you want it in the rare side, 130 is gonna be about the lowest end. You have to hold it the internal temperature 130 for 112 minutes in order for that prime rib to technically be considered safe to eat. Okay. So kind of a neat thing about this, though, you can do, this is when Modern Cuisine comes in, you can actually do this a lot easier through low temp cooking or through sous vide, but that's a different class, different time. 135 degrees, there is no minimum time. Any food that you are cooking from plants, fruits, vegetables, pasta, grains, beans, that are going to be hot held for service. So you're going to cook them and you're going to serve them, or you're going to cook them and you're going to put them in a holding unit, and it's going to be held at least 135, and then serve as you need. So it's 135 for those items, and there is no minimum time. You don't have to have it there for 15 seconds or anything like that. It's an instantaneous when it comes to that product. If you are doing tea, tea is 175. And what's nice about those is, especially if you're using automatic machines, they are already preset those for it. And but it's one of those, again, by having it at that temperature, if there happens to be bacteria on the tea bag or on the tea leaves or in the coffee grounds or anything like that, then that is helping to make it safer to cook with. If you are wanting to cook food in a microwave, hopefully you do want to do this professionally. That is not what's going to your mind. But if for whatever reason you need to cook something in the microwave, the minimum internal cooking temperature for food cooked in the microwave is 165 degrees. That's it. Okay. It doesn't matter if it's meat, if it's seafood, poultry, or eggs, 165 across the board. So you can't go, well, it's meat, so I can do it 145. Nope. Internally, it needs to be 165 if you are cooking via the microwave. So another reason why I recommend don't totally cook by the microwave, please. If you're cooking in a microwave, of course, you want to make sure you're covering the food to prevent drying, because you're going to have moisture loss. But if you can minimize that, that's good. For even cooking, you want to make sure you're rotating or stirring the food through the cooking process, and then let the food stand for a minute or two after cooking to allow the heat to dissipate, and also to allow it to distribute itself better into the product. You want to check the temperature in at least 2 places, because depending on the microwave, sometimes they don't all heat exactly the same across the board on one side to the other. So some general guidelines for you. Make sure you specify the cooking time and minimum internal temperatures in all recipes. So your recipes need to have in the method on what you're doing to it, the actual cooking time and minimum internal temperature. And the thing is remember, the cooking time is just a guideline. It's not a be all. The thing that's going to be when it's done is when it reaches that internal temperature that you need to have it at. Okay. Make sure you're using your thermometers correctly. Make sure you're using the right probe for the job, making sure it's the thickest part of the food that you are temping out, because if you get the thinnest part of the food, yeah, it will reach where you're at, where the other stuff so maybe still raw. Right. And two readings at different locations is not necessarily a bad idea, just to make sure that's not just a fluke as far as being at that proper temperature. Of course, we want to avoid overloading our cooking equipment so it can actually do its job correctly and not necessarily have cold areas. And then we want to make sure we let the temperature of our cooking equipment recover between batches, kind of like I said earlier, when it comes to our deep fat fryers, make sure it gets right up to where it needs to be so it can do its job efficiently. All right, so consumer advisories. We are required to disclose any raw or undercooked TCS items on the menu. All right, and you've seen it before. You see it all the time. The disclosure, you can see the Bill's Burgers disclosure, and then the reminder underneath: consuming raw or undercooked meats, poultry, seafood, shellfish, or eggs may increase your risk of foodborne illness. All right, that's our loophole for when somebody wants their burger mid-rare, because according to the health department, we need to cook that burger to 155 degrees. If it's 155 degrees, it's not mid-rare, right? All right. So by having this is that loophole, this disclosure that lets them know that, hey, we will cook it to your temperature, but note that it's going to increase the risk. Right. So a couple of things. So an asterisk next to the items is an easy way as far as a footnote. And that footnote all states that it's served with raw or undercooked, or contains items that may contain raw or undercooked. So it's just saying, what does that asterisk mean? And then the reminder and the disclosure as far as, hey, if you eat it outside of what the health department recommends temperature wise, you do increase the risk of potentially getting sick. The notice should be posted in the menu somewhere. And you can also provide this information, brochures, table tents, or signs. Now, see, I would just put it on the menu, to be honest. I'm not going to put it on a brochure. I mean, if you're doing, maybe your catering menu is not necessarily a bad idea, but in a brochure about your restaurant, no. Table tents, absolutely not. If I'm even using table tents, the last thing I'm going to do is put the freaking consumer advisory there. I'm going to put the stuff that's hopefully going to bring in more money. That's a different class, but still, I mean, you want that said, the menu makes the most sense to put it in, but you need to make sure that that reminder or that disclosure is there as far as what happens if you are ordering this stuff outside of what the health department recommends. If you have people that are, if you're catering to families and you have kids menus, some of the things that you want to be conscientious about is maybe not offering items on a kids menu if they are raw or undercooked. Meats, poultry, seafood, eggs. So it's not necessarily recommended to offer a children's cut of a filet mignon. We got this 3-ounce filet mignon for the children's cut, because again, they are in that age group where their immune systems have not developed, so they're at higher risk. So by putting something that's potentially could end up making them sick doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, same thing with some of these other ones, making sure that they are being taken care of. And again, if you have kids, kids gravitate towards certain things. Now, not all the same. My kid, she's 14 now, but when she was young, she was adventurous. She still is, and she would be eating things that most kids her age would not be eating. For example, I mean, she started eating tekamaki, which is raw tuna sushi, I think at like age 3. But her dad's a chef and her mom's a foodie, so it kind of came around that way. But I'm not advocating that, hey, you should have sushi on the kids menu, because most kids in the kids menu are probably not going to be wanting to order sushi. So be thinking about who that customer is, but then also be thinking about, okay, these customers there are potentially higher risk when it comes to getting sick. So I don't want to offer items that are increasing that risk because I put it on the menu. So if you are working at a daycare, if you're working at a hospital, if you're working at a nursing home, something like that, you're really never serving raw seed sprouts. No raw or undercooked eggs that are unpasteurized, no raw or undercooked meat or seafood. So that means you're not cooking over easy eggs. You're not doing raw oysters on a half shell for an appetizer for dinner. You're not doing your hamburgers mid-rare or anything like that for those high-risk populations. And of course, you're not doing any unpasteurized milk or juice, because again, we want to minimize the risk to those customers of ours. So what if we have partial cooking during preparation? If we're partially cooking the product, first and foremost, we never want to cook food longer than an hour during that initial cooking. And as soon as that initial cooking is done, we want to cool the food immediately and make sure we freeze it or refrigerate it. If we're refrigerating it, it needs to be at 41 or lower, and make sure you store it away from ready to eat foods, because it's not ready to eat. It's partially cooked. So yes, it might be kind of cooked, but it's still raw in the center. So we can't store it as far as the ready to eat food is concerned. All right. Then we can heat the food to its required minimum internal temperature and then sell it or serve it. If it's not being served, make sure you cool the food if it's not going to be served immediately, or hold it at the right temperature for service. So you can see what they wanted to do with those chicken breasts is they wanted to get the grill marks on it. So they wanted to grill them so they look pretty. And then my guess is then they're going to throw them all into the oven and let them finish that way. So they are doing a partial cook. So they want to cook those chicken breasts. They're just searing them. So they're not going to be cooked for longer than 60 minutes. They get immediately put into refrigeration so they cool down. And then when it comes time to finish them, they're going to go into, let's say, the oven, and they're going to go up to that 165-degree internal temperature. And then they're either going to be served, they're going to be held at 135 or above, and then used for service, or they're going to go into the refrigerator to cool down, where they are now considered ready to eat food. So they could use it for chicken salad or whatever the case may be the next day. So if you are doing partial cooking, you need to have procedures that describe how to monitor and document what corrective actions has to be taken if they're not met, how par cooked items are going to be marked after they're cooked. So you want to make sure how they need to be labeled so we can differentiate between ready to eat product and par cooked products. And how par cooked foods will be stored from ready to eat foods. Because again, remember, they cannot be stored at the same level as ready to eat foods because they're not ready to eat foods at that point. All right, so we're going to reiterate this in 150 when you take professional cooking, because we'll do it with stocks and stuff. But this is really, really important when it comes to cooling food. So when we are cooling food, we are doing this by what we call the two-stage method. The two-stage method states that we have to get our food from between 135 to 70 within 2 hours. So it has to drop between 135 and 70. You have 2 hours to do it. Okay. Once it reaches 70, then you have an additional 4 hours to get it from 70 to 41 for a total of maximum of 6 hours as far as cooling. All right. That 135 to 70, that's the prime bacteria growth range temperature wise. That's why it's a shorter time frame. The second step there, a bacteria can grow, but not as fast. And that's why you have a little bit longer time. So let's say you've made, 5 gallons of soup, right? And you want to chill it and reheat it to serve tomorrow. You need to make sure that that soup gets between 135 to 70 within 2 hours, and then from 70 to 41 within the next 4 hours. If it does not meet those requirements, you have to pitch it. So if you're not being conscientious and you forget about it and you go and check it and it's been 3 hours and it still hasn't hit 70, then you got to pitch it. Now, let me be clear about this. The time does not start until it reaches 135. When you pull it off the stove, it's probably going to be a lot hotter than that. 170, 190, whatever the case may be. Your 2 hours doesn't start until it hits 135, which means you have to be conscientious and checking that temperature on a fairly regular basis to see where it's at as far as the cooling stage. And then once it hits that 135, that's when the clock starts, and you've got to make sure that your things are being taken care of. Okay. Once it gets past that 70, then you got a little bit more leeway, but we still need to make sure we get it down within the extra 4 hours. Okay. If you cool it in less than 2 hours, the remaining time can be used to cool it to 41 or below. The kicker is it can be no longer than 6 hours. Right. So from start to finish, from cooling, once it reaches 135, it needs to be at 41 or below, no longer than 6 hours after the process starts. Okay. So some factors that can affect cooling, the density or the thickness of food. Usually the thicker it is, it retains more heat, which makes it take longer for it to want to cool down. The size of the food, larger size items hold heat in more. So if it's cut into smaller pieces, it's going to cool down faster. There's more surface area. to allow the product to cool down faster. The other thing you can do is divide larger containers into smaller containers or pans. So if you got 5 gallons of soup, maybe don't put it all in a 5-gallon bucket or a 5-gallon Cambro. Transfer it into a couple of 3-gallon or a couple or 3 2-gallon containers and let them cool down that way, because you have more surface area, so it will cool down faster than if you have a full 5-gallon. Okay. Stainless steel transfers heat away from the food faster than plastic, and shallow pans let the heat from food disperse faster than deep pans. So if you have something in a 2-inch shallow pan, it's going to help disperse faster than if you have 4 inches, because you have more thickness, so the heat's going to be retained more in those thicker areas. Just like it makes sense to not keep it in a 5-gallon container, but transfer it to smaller containers so you have more surface area. So some ways that you can cool food. The most common way is ice water bath, especially with liquids. So you can see that there in the top picture. So you got an ice water combination. You put your containers that have the product into that ice water bath and let them chill. You have specialty equipment called a blast chiller that can quickly chill product down through the temperature danger zone. You can use what they call an ice paddle, which is what you see in the picture below. Those are kind of cool because you can use those in conjunction with an ice water bath. And if you do that, you're cooling from the outside in, because the ice water bath, and the inside out, because that ice paddle is actually filled with water that you put into the freezer, and it freezes as a solid piece of ice. But when you put it in, yeah, it melts, but the water stays there. So it cools from the inside out as well as from the outside in by using an ice water bath. That's our preferred method here at the Culinary Institute. You can also use ice or cold water as an ingredient. So let's say you need to add liquid to the product to thin it out. You could add ice, or you could add cold water to help drop the temperature as well, if that makes sense. When you're storing it, food for further cooling, you want to loosely cover the container before storing them. Don't do a tight cover. If you do a tight lid or a tight cover, it's not going to allow the steam to escape. Right? You can have food uncovered if it's protected from contamination. So storing uncovered containers above other foods, especially any raw products, will help prevent cross-contamination. Now, when you reheat food, if you're reheating food for immediate service, it can be reheated to any temperature if it was cooked and cooled correctly. Okay. So if you're going to heat it and eat it, you can do it to whatever temperature, as long as it was done correctly the first time. If you're going to reheat and then hold it, you have to reheat to 165 degrees for 15 seconds, and you have to heat it up within 2 hours. Right? That's important. Anything that is commercially processed and packaged ready foods, they can be heated to an internal temperature of 100, at least 135. But like, let's say the biggest thing I've seen is, especially with non-commercial people, let's say they want to do a cheese sauce for nachos and they put it in their crock pot. Well, we need to get it up to temperature within 2 hours. A crock pot's not meant for fast cooking. It's meant for low and slow. And so you're not going to get hot holding within that 2 hours that you need it to be. So you need to do it with on a different piece of equipment, and then you could hold it in the crock pot, assuming that can hold at least 135, and then you'd be okay. But you need to be conscientious about those things. And remember, as a general rule of thumb, when you reheat to hold, it's 165 degrees, 15 seconds. A lot of information today, a lot of things, times, temperatures, those things, and they're all really, really important, because again, when we're working in the kitchen, we want to make sure we're not doing things to make our customers sick. Please, 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 especially pay attention to those times and temperatures. Those not only are important things for everyday life when it comes to working in a commercial kitchen or at your home kitchen even, but it's also going to be things that I know you're going to see on my tests, you're going to see on the ServSafe exam at the end of the semester, things along those lines. So again, another important chapter, because it's something that we deal with directly as far as the cooking of our food.